Since Donald Trump returned to the presidency, one of his administration's highest priorities has been pushing ICE to be ever more confrontational in their raids for immigrants and migrants in the United States. As far as tactics, they have escalated to lying to other government authorities, like lying to public school officials about having parental permission to enter the school in order to kidnap and deport undocumented children, and using family members as bait, by holding a family member who is a citizen in order to lure a different family member who is a non-citizen out of their home. U.S. citizens have defended their neighbors against these raids, and as ICE has escalated, so have the ways U.S. citizens opposed ICE's actions. This has catalyzed into the federal escalations over the first weekend of June 2025 in Los Angeles. At time of writing, the events that have garnered serious national coverage are the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops by the federal government, followed by the mobilization of 700 Marines. If you listen to California Governor Gavin Newsom, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, and the Los Angeles Police Department, they have all stated some variation of the deployment of the National Guard was an unnecessary escalation, and the LAPD had the situation under control until the Guard's involvement. If you listen to President Donald Trump, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, or Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, they have all said variations of Los Angeles is run by criminals, and the federal government must step in to restore order from chaos. If my introduction didn't make clear which narrative I am on the side of, it's the first one. But that's not actually the focus of this video. It is about protest and action in the face of fascism. That is what Trump, Miller, and Noem are doing, both by their actions and by their rhetoric. Before I get to that, however, I am going to quickly run down the sequence of events that happened in Los Angeles from June 6th to the time of writing, which is June 11th, 2025. Much of this summary is based off of a CBS News timeline. On June 6th, Friday afternoon, ICE raids several locations within the city of Los Angeles, which led to crowds gathering in protest over ICE's actions. By 3:30 p.m. local time, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass had posted on Twitter condemning ICE in Los Angeles, saying, "We will not stand for this." By 6 p.m., protesters had gathered outside the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building in downtown LA, where ICE had brought migrants they had detained from earlier raids. The Metropolitan Detention Center is part of the same building complex. There were some clashes between protesters and federal law enforcement by around 6:30 p.m. The Los Angeles Police Department was contacted around this time, taking nearly 55 minutes to arrive due to traffic, people on the streets, and, according to the LAPD, the fact federal agents had already deployed chemical irritants into the area prior to LAPD's arrival. Even before their arrival, LAPD had ordered protesters to leave the area, and by 8 p.m., LAPD officers were on the ground and actively blocking the crowd from the federal building complex in downtown LA. On the morning of June 7th, footage showing ICE officers outside of a Home Depot in Paramount, California, led to rumors of an imminent immigration raid. This is on the basis of statements made by Stephen Miller, telling ICE to raid places like Home Depot. His rationale is laid out in a Wall Street Journal report. Agents didn't need to develop target lists of immigrants suspected of being in the U.S. illegally, a long-standing practice, Miller said. Instead, he directed them to target Home Depot, where day laborers typically gather for hire, or 7-Eleven convenience stores. Over the course of several hours, a crowd had gathered that had the effect of boxing ICE and other federal agents in. Around 11 a.m., the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department responded to a call about a large crowd blocking traffic. In the late afternoon, the department declared the demonstration an unlawful assembly and warned protesters to leave. By this time, protests had also begun in the nearby city of Compton. At 5:13 p.m., Governor Gavin Newsom posted on Twitter, saying, "The federal government is moving to take over the California National Guard and deploy 2,000 soldiers. That move is purposely inflammatory and will only escalate tensions." By 6 p.m., President Trump had signed a memo ordering the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops. Shortly after 7 p.m., Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth posted on Twitter that not only was the National Guard being mobilized immediately, but he would also mobilize active-duty Marines from Camp Pendleton in San Diego County. As Saturday evening wore on, protests spread to additional locations within the greater Los Angeles area, but there were no notable incidents between protesters and law enforcement. On Sunday morning, June 8th, the first 300 National Guard troops have been deployed in downtown Los Angeles. For most of the day, the continuation of protests were peaceful. A march from Los Angeles City Hall to the Metropolitan Detention Center led to a face-to-face between protesters and a line of federal agents stationed outside around 3 p.m., with some scuffles ensuing. Around 3:30 p.m., Governor Newsom officially asked the Trump administration to rescind the National Guard deployment order. At roughly the same time, the Los Angeles Police Department issued a dispersal order and warned arrests would be made. There were clashes between LAPD and protesters over the next several hours. In one notable incident that was caught on camera, an LAPD officer fired a rubber bullet directly at Australian journalist Lauren Tomasi while her back was turned. It wasn't until after 9 p.m. that events died down. It included at least one store being looted and numerous buildings being tagged, including the LAPD headquarters and U.S. courthouse. Monday, June 9th, started with a fourth day of protests, beginning outside the Robert Young Federal Building, directly adjacent to the previously mentioned Edward R. Roybal and Metropolitan Detention Center. Around noon, Newsom announced he was suing the Trump administration for unlawfully bypassing the governor by putting National Guard troops under federal control without his, the governor's, permission. Unrelated to Newsom's announcement, several hours later, the military issued a statement regarding the activation of 700 Marines to join the National Guard in the Los Angeles area. In the late afternoon, Pentagon Chief Spokesman Sean Parnell announced an additional 2,000 California National Guard members were to be mobilized as well. It was only after these announcements that the protests outside the Robert Young Federal Building stopped being peaceful. Even then, it was only after the LAPD began to push the crowd from the area, with officers firing pepper-filled rounds and rubber bullets into the crowd. The LAPD said around 100 people were arrested, mostly for failure to disperse. On Tuesday, June 10th, the 700 Marines arrived in the Los Angeles area, though they were not yet deployed. This did not stop a fifth day of protests outside of the federal buildings, this time in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center, though the number of protesters was less from previous days. Around 6 p.m., Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass issued a curfew for the downtown area to begin at 8 p.m. and ending at 6 a.m. Wednesday morning. Before the curfew went into effect, the protest outside the federal buildings escalated as some individuals threw objects towards National Guard troops. LAPD officers arrived within half an hour, roughly at the start of the curfew, and the crowd began to disperse. It wasn't until around 9 p.m., an hour after the curfew's official start, that LAPD began making arrests of those that refused to leave. This brings us to Wednesday, June 11th, the day opening with Mayor Karen Bass stating the nightly curfew in downtown LA would remain in effect until the situation had de-escalated. In an escalation from the current status quo, the U.S. Northern Command announced later that day the 700 Marines sent to the LA area would be ready to deploy within 2 days. As for the protests on this day, there were multiple marches within downtown Los Angeles, as well as other gatherings in surrounding cities such as Paramount. After 6 p.m., there were multiple incidents of people throwing objects at officers, though it was only after the 8 p.m. curfew that significant scuffles occurred as the LAPD enforced the curfew zone. One notable incident was one march deliberately leaving the curfew zone before 8 p.m. All indications are this march left the area peacefully with no police involvement. Ultimately, between Friday and Wednesday, approximately 850 people have been arrested across Los Angeles County, mostly for failure to disperse. Almost all of these arrests have taken place after Trump called in the National Guard. As of time of writing, this is how events in Los Angeles have played out. The reason I have outlined the sequence of events in the level of detail I have is to illustrate how the situation has escalated and how the National Guard, and especially the Marines, are not only completely unnecessary, but are a provocation in and of themselves. And I would argue their deployment is a deliberate provocation by the federal government under Trump. Not only have they not been necessary when it comes to getting protesters to leave the streets over the last few days, the actions in question having been handled by the LAPD, but their deployment has massively expanded the scope of these protests. Instead of being a few incidents in Los Angeles over the weekend, the protests have become a daily occurrence and expanded across the state and country. Solidarity protests have taken place across the United States in places as diverse as Oregon, Illinois, Texas, and Iowa over the last several days, with some of those protests also experiencing their own crackdowns, such as Texas. And yet, when it comes to the protests taking place, they have remained mostly peaceful, even in Los Angeles, with most of the violence, graffiti, looting, and arrests taking place in the evening as the LAPD attempts to break up the protests in question. Here, I will repeat, the National Guard has not only been entirely unnecessary in these efforts, they have not even deployed to assist in clearing out protesters. And I will also repeat, even the level of violence currently present in Los Angeles is in direct response to the deployment of the National Guard in the first place. At the end of Saturday, June 7th's protests, the LAPD put out a public statement commending the protesters for their peaceful demonstration and exercising their First Amendment rights responsibly. Note, this was sent after Trump announced he was deploying 2,000 National Guard forces, and after Hegseth announced he was ordering Marines to stand by from Camp Pendleton. This means that as of Saturday evening, the LAPD was publicly stating the protests were under control, even while Trump and Hegseth went around the California governor and local authorities to send in the National Guard and prepare to send in Marines. If these actions had not been done, it is very likely things would have cooled off by Monday. Instead, these deployments inflamed protests not only in Los Angeles, but elsewhere across the country. Heck, just Hegseth's announcement that Marines would be deployed from Camp Pendleton led to protests at the gates of Camp Pendleton. It is yet another instance of this administration engaging in actions that exacerbate tensions and inflame opposition. The manner in which ICE raids are being implemented, which started the June 6th Los Angeles protests in the first place, is another example. Stephen Miller said he wanted ICE to target Home Depots and 7-Elevens. Not because he is targeting criminals or even undocumented individuals. He just wants to deport immigrants, specifically non-white ones. These directives already push the bounds of what is actually legal for ICE to do, and there are legal methods for American citizens to engage in open actions to oppose those efforts. Legal actions that the citizens of LA engaged in that led the federal government to call in military forces. And I would argue these escalations and inflaming of tensions is exactly what Trump and his administration want. They want to have justification to invoke the Insurrection Act. They want to have justification to declare martial law. The Trump administration is constrained in a lot of the actions they want to engage in by civilian administration and the rule of law. As the authoritarian regime they are, they desperately want tools to circumvent both. Which makes it all the more imperative for those that oppose the Trump administration and their actions to maintain peaceful tactics, even in the face of National Guard and Marine deployments. It isn't about trying to prevent the administration from actually invoking the Insurrection Act, or to prevent them from declaring martial law. They will attempt to craft the narrative to justify either of those actions no matter what protesters do. It's about maintaining support from a majority of the population. It is important to remember that in any given population, basically no matter the form of government or society, most people want stability to be able to get on with their lives on a day-to-day basis. In the United States in particular, one of the ways this manifests is a plurality or outright majority of Americans value civility in public actions. To engage otherwise requires the time and effort to build up buy-in from the general public. Without that buy-in, even if the federal government is provoking the uncivil actions, a plurality of the apathetic will still blame the protesters, especially with large swaths of the media simply reporting what the federal government is saying as true. For protesters to keep and hold majority support in the near term, it will require continued peaceful demonstration even as the Trump administration escalates. Something I would not be surprised if they continue. But if Trump and his administration do continue to escalate because of peaceful protest, That is a set of circumstances in which a plurality or outright majority of Americans will end up blaming Trump for the disruption of day-to-day stability, as long as protests remain as peaceful as possible. That is a circumstance in which the administration loses the tacit support of the apathetic and will lead to a greater number of people moving to active opposition. As I post this video, tomorrow on June 14th, 2025, there are thousands of planned No Kings protests set to take place across the United States as a counter to Donald Trump's birthday military parade. Yes, I know the stated reason is for the military's 250th birthday, but let's be real. This parade would not be happening if not for Trump ordering it for his birthday. If I had to guess, what was originally expected to be major turnout for the No Kings protests will be far higher than anticipated, thanks to administration actions in Los Angeles. If you are planning on attending such protests, I strongly advocate to remain peaceful, even if, especially if, confronted by police. It is unlikely for the crackdown that has happened in LA to take place elsewhere for the No Kings protest, but it isn't outside the realm of possibility. Regardless, I advocate for any of my American viewers. Please stay calm and stay safe. Keep your eye on the long game. Remember, it may feel like we are at the end of history, but we are in the middle of it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you want to hear me talk about history and politics in the future, hit the subscribe and bell while you're at it. In the meantime, I already have several videos posted for you to enjoy or critique, and I invite your input in the comments below. Until next time, take care.